Okay, wonderful to have the opportunity to do a little learning and a little history with you this evening. This is the third and final installment of our series in this little Zionism mini course. And our subject today is none other than David Ben-Gurion. So let me begin by thanking our sponsors, many sponsors of this series. Thank you for your ongoing generosity. And let me just say up front that Ben Gurion is a big topic, and if there's something that we don't cover, it's not because it's not important. It's almost at some point a little arbitrary what to focus on and where to focus. My goal is really to whet your appetite in the hopes that if something strikes your fancy, you will pursue it further. There are many, many biographies of David Ben-Gurion, but two are of recent note. Tom Segev wrote a biography called "The State at Any Cost," and with the Yale University series, Anita Shapira wrote a biography called Ben-Gurion. Tom Segev is a journalist. Anita Shapira is a historian. So the two different takes on David Ben-Gurion, but a lot of wonderful material in each of those books, and I rely on some of it for the material that I prepared for you this evening. Just by a show of hands, did anyone here meet Ben-Gurion? Okay, I see at least one hand. So that's great. You know, one of the dangers of teaching modern history or 20th century history is somebody could raise your hand and say, but I was there. Let me tell you what actually happened. So I apologize in advance for those of you who know some of this history better than I do. David Ben-Gurion died in 1973. So there's a lot of people who are around today who knew him and heard him and wrote to him. So we take advantage of all those resources. What I want to do with you in the time that we have is briefly review David Ben-Gurion's biography. I want to talk about some of his successes and achievements, and also identify some of the areas where scholars have found critiques in the life of David Ben-Gurion. I want to examine his relationship with the Arabs, his relationship with the Bible, and his relationship with diaspora Jews, particularly Jews of the United States. I want to turn to some lessons of his life that I think are relevant for our moment. And I want to close with an excerpt that I find very moving. Okay. So with your permission, our story begins in Plonsk, in Poland in 1886, where a man named David Green is born. He's born into a traditional and observant family. He studies in Cheder. It happens to be there's a lot of Zionist activity and a lot of Haskalah activity in Plonsk. And some of the Chadarim where he studies actually don't teach in Yiddish; they teach in Hebrew, which is amazing to think about at the end of the end of the 20th century. And the Chibat Zion, which was founded in the early 1880s, has a big influence in Plonsk. And so Ben-Gurion, as he'll come to be known, comes of age in a community with a big Zionist influence and a family with an important Zionist influence. His father was an active Zionist. Ben-Gurion's really only educated until the time of his bar mitzvah. His parents can't really afford to send him to high school. Tom Segev, who I mentioned, wrote a recent biography, said when he was 20, I don't remember what year this is. Tom Segev, you could Google it. I don't know how old he is. He said he was, I think, around 20. He was editing his college newspaper at Hebrew University, and he went to meet Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion's retired. And he said Ben-Gurion, met with him for hours, and everyone says this about him. He had like all the time in the world for you. So he met with him and a couple of his buddies for hours, and Ben-Gurion in that meeting said, "I was a Zionist from the time I was 3." So Tom Segev says, maybe not from the time he was 3, but certainly his upbringing was suffused with the sense of Zionism. Zionism is everything for him. He wanted a Jewish land. He wanted a Jewish homeland. I'll just also say, in the interest of disclosure and what it means to study Ben Gurion, Ben Gurion wrote everything down. He was always writing. Okay? So we talked about what it means when we talk about Ahad Ha'am and Jabotinsky, that they were writers, they were journalists, and we have a lot of material that they wrote. I think, even though Ben Gurion was only a journalist for a very short time, pound for pound, I'm sure he wrote much more than either of them. People say when they met Ben Gurion, all they saw was his forehead, because he was always writing the whole meeting. He was just writing, and then somebody would say, "Mr. Ben Gurion, what are you writing?" And he would say something like, "I'm writing Jewish history," right? Because he had this sense that what was going on was going to matter, and he was actually right. Anita Shapira, says that Ben Gurion wrote so much. He wrote so much that if you're looking for something, like to say, "Oh, Ben Gurion was," finish that sentence, you can always find it, because at some point Ben Gurion said something and wrote it down, and it's just endless. Tens of thousands of letters, people that he corresponded with, some official, some private, and we have it all. I'm exaggerating a little, but you can go online, you go to the Ben Gurion archive, website, and you could search for anything, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of documents that he wrote and people who wrote to him, and he kept copies of everything. Okay. And then I'll just say, at the end of his life, he wrote even more, right? His memoirs and histories. One reviewer said it's telling that Ben Gurion alternates between the first and third person narrative as if he were undecided whether he was writing history or autobiography, and I find that a very telling quote. He was also a lifelong lover of books. Wherever he went to a bookshop, he collected books, he always tried to get new books, he shipped books from here and from there, and you could visit his library in Sde Boker today. By his mid-teens, Ben Gurion led a Zionist group called Ezra, whose members spoke only Hebrew. And at the age of 18, he had moved to Warsaw, he became a teacher, and he joined the socialist Zionist group called Poalei Zion, which was the workers of Zion. And as you know, the socialist identity was very core to who Ben Gurion was. Okay, he arrives in Israel it's Palestine at the time, in 1906. He wrote in his memoirs that Plansk, his hometown, sent more Jews to Poland than any other town its size. And he said, we emigrated not for negative reasons of escape, but for the positive purpose of rebuilding a homeland. And that's actually a kind of very self-conscious differentiating mark. We say, scholars like to talk about this, there's the first Aliyah, which is 1882 to 1903, and the sense of those people is they're fleeing. You got to get out because there's a pogrom, and you move to Palestine. 1904 to 1914, there's another wave. The first Aliyah is maybe 30,000. The second Aliyah is another 35,000. Again, mostly Jews from Russia, and they're coming to Palestine. But as Ben Gurion says, they're coming because they believe. Right, this is an idealistic group of Zionists, an idealistic group of immigrants. I'll just say in passing, and sometimes this does not get appreciated, but the second Aliyah was a time of crisis for Palestine. Everybody was leaving. We don't really have statistics, and nobody likes to talk about this because it's so unflattering, but it was so difficult to make a go of it in Palestine. Usually they throw around something like a third of the people who came, had to leave. Ben Gurion himself, in one of his letters or memoirs, says in his estimate, 90% of the people were leaving. Okay, so this is an amazing image. You show up in a boat from Eastern Europe, wherever, in 1906, and this is to say 100 people get off the boat and 500 people get on the boat, because they're leaving Palestine. Okay, and again, it's just a footnote in this story, but it's very dispiriting. And you think of, wow, we're Zionists and we're here. And it's like, well, but why is everyone going the other direction? Okay, and they're going in the other direction because these are people who understood and had tried, and understood that it was very difficult to make it in this new land. Anita Shapiro has a great line. She says in her biography, I'll just give you the quote, source number one, if you have it on the source sheet. She says, in describing a leader's emergence, there is usually a tendency to discern future greatness, or at least signs of it, in an earlier period. You can usually tell, like there's something. This is not so with Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion played only a marginal role. The history of the Second Aliyah can be recounted without mentioning his name. Okay? These early years, like if you were in a bettor's market or you're predicting, like you would not have plucked Ben-Gurion out of that group and said, that's the man who's destined for greatness. Sometimes you can't tell. Worked as a farmer for several years in Jewish agricultural settlements in the coastal plain and in the Galilee. He took on the name Ben-Gurion around 1909, but he had malaria and there's nothing to eat and there's a lot of hardship for these guys and he's working in the field and the sun is beating down and it's not for him. So he becomes involved in the creation of the first agricultural workers commune, which evolved into the Kvutza and finally the kibbutz, and helped establish a Jewish self-defense group called HaShomer. And I have it in source number 2. In the interest of time, I won't share it with you. But you can see from his early writings and even from his midlife writings, like he is a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He is an ideologue. He believes in this. He was an admirer of Lenin. Okay, he understood who Lenin was and what he was about. He's a revolutionary and a Zionist and a socialist, and it all goes together. In 1923, I think it was, he actually took a trip to Russia just to see, like, what are they doing right here in this new communist world that they've created. It was like, okay, I'm a social science, I'm interested in this. What can we bring back from the agricultural innovations of Russia, 1923. Works briefly as a journalist and joins the editorial staff of Ha'achdut, which is a journal put out by his group, this Poalei Tzion. 1913, he and a friend leave Palestine. They go to Constantinople, the same Ottoman Empire, to study law. And they don't make it through law school. Obviously, World War I breaks out. But it's very important to point out that at this point, and for the next few years, Ben-Gurion was very taken with the Ottoman gestalt and the Ottoman culture, and he really believed that the future of the Jewish state would depend on the grace of the Ottomans. Like, this was the thinking. The Ottomans are in charge of Palestine. If we're going to achieve a state, it's going to, right, the road to Palestine, leads through Constantinople. After the outbreak of World War I, and again, this is a footnote in history, fascinating footnote in history, but the Jews are expelled from the Ottoman Empire because he's like, you're a Zionist agitator and you're out. Okay? So where does Ben-Gurion go? Ben-Gurion travels on behalf of the socialist Zionist cause and relocates to New York. And Ira, thank you for sending this. I'm not sure how long it's been there, but 43rd Street on the east side was renamed at some point Ben-Gurion Place. I'm not sure if that's where he lived or that's where he worked, but Ben-Gurion lives in New York and travels around the U.S., and we'll talk more about this, but just park that in your mind. He's spending much of the time during World War I here in the United States. 1920, or I should say, following the Balfour Declaration, 1917, Ben-Gurion joined Jabotinsky's Jewish Legion. The two would become arch enemies, but at this moment, they're both kind of on the same team. Sails back to the Middle East to join the War of Liberation of Palestine from Ottoman rule, and Ben-Gurion makes a 180, and he recognizes it's not going to be the Ottomans who are going to give us independent Jewish homeland. 1920, he becomes one of the co-founders of the General Federation of Labor, which is known as the Histadrut. He goes on to become a Secretary General, and it becomes the most powerful organization in the Yishuv. Okay. Now, the early 1920s, Ben-Gurion believes is a pivotal time for the future of the Jewish state. Jewish life in Europe has been totally destabilized. Okay. Britain is now in control of Palestine, and it's time for immigrants to come. And he wanted to create a kind of unified political social structure, like in his socialist dream. There's no competing, there's no competing factions, there's no competing parties. We're all just collective. 1924, when the immigrations, the Johnson-Reed Act, 1924 in America, so it becomes very hard for Jews or anybody from Eastern Europe to immigrate to the United States. So Ben-Gurion begins to appreciate the need to facilitate immigration of European Jews to Palestine. Where are they going to go? They had been going, by and large. The biggest numbers of immigrants were coming to the US. That's now not possible. So let's create a pathway in conjunction with the British to be able to get Jews from Europe to Palestine. Okay? And the core belief, and this is so important for the life and legacy of Ben-Gurion, his core belief was keep the pathways of immigration open. If we could just get more Jews onto this land, we'll create a Jewish majority in Palestine, and that will lead to the solution to our problems. Okay. Now, it just so happens 1924 also begins the fourth Aliyah, and there's tens of thousands of immigrants. But the problem is, for Ben-Gurion, these are not like worker party immigrants. Okay. These are traders and merchants. They're not interested in being farmers. So this Zionist utopia has to give way to capitalism. And this is really a beginning of a kind of class war that Ben-Gurion is all too happy to wage, that goes on for the next 10 years and even longer. There are these ongoing clashes and debates, ideological and practical, between the socialists and the revisionists, under the ideological leadership of Zeb Jabotinsky, who we talked about last week. Okay. The Histadrut rapidly becomes the central force in social, economic, and even security matters in the land. It becomes kind of a state within a state. And in 1930, the labor factions are unifying, and they create this party that becomes Mapai, the Israeli Workers' Party. Ben-Gurion is at its head. 1935, he becomes the chairman of the Zionist Executive, the highest body, leading body of world Zionism, and also the head of the Jewish Agency, which is the executive branch of the movement. The second half of the 1930s, the British are talking about partition. Obviously, it's complicated with the Arabs and the interests of the British. Ben-Gurion is enthusiastic about the idea of partition. Even if we're not going to get the whole thing, okay, we don't need the whole thing. Let's just get a foothold and let's have a beginning of a Jewish state. Okay. 1939, Britain changes its Middle East policy, and it abandons its sympathetic stance toward the Jews, and it adopts a much more sympathetic attitude toward the Arabs. Lots of restrictions to immigration and to settlement in Palestine. And of course, by the end of that year, Germany has invaded Poland, and there's a tension, there's a conflict. You're Ben-Gurion, you're a socialist, you're a Zionist, you're dreaming of a homeland. It's mandatory Palestine. You're really against the British, but then what happens when the British become the best hope against the Nazis? This is complicated. Okay. So by the end of the war, Ben-Gurion has called upon the Jewish community to rise against England and begin a period of quote-unquote fighting Zionism. Again, he's back and forth dozens of times over the course of his career between Palestine and America. And again, we'll talk about more about that relationship in a few minutes. At the end of World War II, Ben-Gurion is doing everything he can to lead the Palestinian Jewish community and the global Jewish community in the struggle against the British mandate. Now, not because it's not dramatic and not because it's not important in the life of Ben-Gurion, but I'm not going to go through the story of the establishment of the State of Israel. That's, I think, known to everyone here. But of course, as you know, on May 14th, 1948, after the United Nations November decision to create a partition plan, May 14th, 1948, Ben-Gurion declares the State of Israel, and he actually helped author the Declaration of Independence. Now, this obviously a turning point not just for Jewish history, but also for David Ben-Gurion. And historians focus a lot on this because the person and the persona and the personality of the person or the character who is the one to bring forth statehood may or may not be the right person to lead that state. So Ben-Gurion has lots and lots of achievements and successes as the prime minister and as a political leader post 1948. But there are also some important critiques, and there's some like self-consciousness about this. You could see it in sources 3 and 4 in your source sheet. I'll just put it up so it's in front of you. In source number 3, he wrote this a few years after the State of Israel came into existence. He says, there was nothing that the Jewish people yearned for more over hundreds of years than a Jewish state. There was nothing the Jewish people was less qualified for than a Jewish state. Okay, and then he said, for hundreds of years, the Jewish people offered up a question/prayer, can a state be found for the people? No one considered the horrifying question, can a people be found for the state once it is established? Okay, and what was true for the people on some level was true for Ben-Gurion. Was he the right person for this job? In many ways, yes, and in some ways, no. 1953, Ben-Gurion leaves the government, retires to Sde Boker, and then he comes out of retirement in 1955 and assumes the post of defense minister and later again the premiership. He continues as prime minister and leads the country in the 1956 Sinai campaign, finally steps down from office in 1963 and retires from political life in 1970. He dies in 1973. Okay. So let me just share a brief catalog of what scholars consider to be some of his most important achievements post-1948. Okay, but let me just pause and ask if there are any questions up until this point. Post 1948, okay, some extraordinary accomplishments. First of all, he establishes the institutions of the Israeli state. Right, he oversees the creation of Israel's governmental systems, the cabinet, civil service, court, national administrative framework. Next, and this really happens already in the lead up to and war for independence, he unifies the Jewish military forces into the IDF. Now, this came at a high cost. Part of this consolidation happened over the terrible tragedy of the Altalena. Okay, so you know the story. It was June 1948, just weeks after the establishment of the State of Israel. And the ship, which was named the Altalena, was organized by the Irgun, had arrived off the coast carrying a large shipment of arms and fighters. Okay, at the time, Ben-Gurion was trying to unify the Jewish militias into a single national party, into an IDF. And the Irgun agreed in principle, but there was like some internal squabbling over, who's in control of these fighters, who's in control of these weapons. And Ben-Gurion saw this as a kind of existential threat to the authority of the new state. We can't have like private militias and underground. We just need one central authority. Of course, he was right. Okay, there had to be one sovereign power and one unified army, and allowing a separate militia to have arms, it's not going to fly. When the ship reached the shore near Tel Aviv, tensions escalated into violence, and after failed attempts to resolve the standoff, Ben-Gurion ordered the IDF to take control of the ship, even by force if necessary. Fighting broke out. Begin on one side, Ben-Gurion on the other. Fighting broke out between the IDF and the Irgun, and ultimately the IDF shelled the Altalena, set it ablaze. 16 Irgun fighters and 3 IDF soldiers were killed in the confrontation. And the episode was one of the most dramatic and painful moments in Israel's early history, almost brought the country to a brink of civil war, and it established a defining principle for Israeli statehood, the notion that the unified army has to be under one dominion and under one authority. Begin, despite the losses on his side, ordered his followers not to retaliate and prevented further escalation. And in retrospect, the Altalena is often seen as a turning point that solidified control over the military. And at the same time, the revisionists and the Begin followers, like they never forgot it. Next on the list of Ben Gurion achievements, okay, he insisted, even though they were only in control of half of Jerusalem, it was a divided Jerusalem, 1948 to 1967, Ben Gurion insisted that Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish homeland. Next on his list of accomplishments, he absorbed massive waves of immigration under his leadership. Israel absorbed hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees from Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. And they doubled the country's population within just a few years. Of course, Operation Magic Carpet was the centerpiece of this effort. Ben Gurion developed the Negev. Okay. He was a huge proponent of developing the Negev. There's a great story they tell. He wanted to build up Beersheba and turn it into a hub and a city, and he organized a committee to study the feasibility of turning Beersheba into a city. Because you got to study the agriculture and the economy and what infrastructure, what's going to work. And the committee goes through this whole process, and they come back to Ben Gurion and they say, we did all our homework, we went through all the calculations. We cannot establish a community in Beersheba. Okay, so the aide says to Ben Gurion, this is the conclusion of the committee, Mr. Prime Minister, what should we do? And Ben Gurion said, we should appoint a new committee. Okay, so he didn't take no for an answer, and especially when it came to the Negev, which was very close to his heart, he ultimately triumphed. Reparations, another very controversial topic, but Ben Gurion believed that it was worth and it was acceptable to take reparations from West Germany, and he brought critical funds that helped build infrastructure and industry at a time when economically the Jewish state was struggling, and of course you can understand the opposition, the money coming from a country with all the blood of the Holocaust on its hands. Okay. He expanded higher education and scientific research. The Weizmann Institute and other research institutes were started under Ben Gurion's authority. He laid the foundations of Israel's nuclear program and established the Dimona Nuclear Research Center. He was instrumental in constructing the National Water Carrier, which was a huge and enormously important national infrastructure project to funnel water from the Kinneret, from the Sea of the Galilee in the north, to the rest of Israel. And Ad Hayom Hazeh, right? That remains until this day. That remains a very important infrastructure project for all of Israel. I'll just add one more to the list because it's close to my heart. Ben Gurion was instrumental in creating a project to create an archive of the microfilmed Hebrew manuscripts, that any microfilmed Hebrew manuscripts he could get his hands on, and create an archive at the Hebrew University. And that was the precursor to the 21st century ambition of the National Library to digitize every Hebrew manuscript of the world. Ben Gurion understood, right? He had this profound sense of history and he had this profound sense of destiny. He understood that this is not just the homeland of a bunch of Zionists and socialists and immigrants. This is the homeland of the Jewish people, and there's a cultural treasure of the Jewish people. Those are our books, those are our texts, those are our manuscripts. We need to keep them, we need to find them, we need to preserve them, not just for now, but for all eternity. Let me share with you 4 critiques. There could be 100, there could be 2, 4 critiques that come out of the scholarship around Ben Gurion's post-1948 leadership. Okay. One is, class was very important to Ben Gurion, and there's a trope, and this wasn't unique to Ben Gurion. This was a trope among the Ashkenazic, Eastern European-born Zionist pioneers in the early days of the state. Is like, we got here first, were the owners of Jewish history, and these immigrants from Arab lands, also known as Sephardim, they're not part of this project. They're second class citizens. I'll just share with you this quote from Tom Segev. It's source number 5. He says he thought that the Jews in Arab lands played a passive role in the history of the Jewish people. The lands in which they resided were replete with ignorance, poverty, and slavery, and had fallen far behind the European nations. And it took a long time. It took a long time for Israel to move past this kind of sense that there's a first class and second class citizens in Israel. You can look in source number 6. In the interest of time, I'll just summarize it for you. But there's a scholar named Meron Medzini, and he wrote this a few years ago. So one of the key shortcomings was the sense that Israel could just be a melting pot. Like, just bring everybody in and we're good. And there wasn't enough infrastructure and there wasn't enough process around that immigration in the early days of the state to absorb and to move through that huge absorption of immigrants, and that came at some cost. Second critique is Ben-Gurion's famous miscalculation about the role of the Haredim. And you know the story about how he made a dispensation for 400 yeshiva students who don't need to serve in the army. And of course, Ben-Gurion's calculation was, we'll just make a concession. Like, all the yeshivas are destroyed, the great hubs of Torah learning are gone. So it's not the worst thing in the world to have a few hundred Torah scholars sitting and learning in yeshiva. So he never imagined that it would become such a huge percentage of the society that we'd be sitting and learning. In source number 7, I have an excerpt for you. It's a little bit of a long story, so I'll just summarize it. But in 1952, Ben-Gurion met with the Chazon Ish. Okay, Reb Abraham Yeshaya Karelitz, also known as the Chazon Ish, was the kind of undisputed Gadol Hador, the undisputed head of the Haredi community. And Ben-Gurion wanted to, come to some kind of agreement with the Haredim, and the Chazon Ish basically wouldn't budge, and said something to the effect of, you're doing our part, we're doing our part, and this is the way it's going to be. It was very cordial. The Chazon Ish thought very highly of Ben-Gurion, and vice versa. But the Chazon Ish was not willing to make this concession, nor was Ben-Gurion willing to push harder in that moment of history. And again, hindsight is 2020, but the world might have looked very different if the early negotiations had gone differently between Ben-Gurion and the Chazon Ish, or between the secular Zionists and the religious parties. Third, also with so much contemporary resonance, third critique, Ben-Gurion was allergic to the notion of a constitution. There are many opportunities, the commissions and constitution creation commissions, and Ben-Gurion just didn't want it. Why didn't he want it? So he didn't want it because it would have limited his authority, right? It would have placed the court above the elected institutions of the land, right? It would mean that the court could always come along and say, "Oh, well, the Constitution says X, Y, and Z, so plans A, B, and C, sorry, you can't do it." But if there's no Constitution, well, then how powerful is the court? And that remains, an unresolved issue. And it's a little funny how the politics have kind of realigned. But in the 1950s, the person against whatever you want to call it, judicial reform, the person against the Constitution, the person against giving the courts more power was Ben Gurion. Okay. And you can just see it in source number 8. Here it is. Let me see if I can enlarge this a drop for you. No, I think I went the wrong way. Source number 8. Okay, can you see this? So it's not at all surprising, end of the first line, it's not at all surprising that Ben Gurion objected to the immediate legislation of the Constitution, since it threatened to limit the power of the Knesset and that of the government, which in the Israeli political system acted and for all intents and purposes still acts as the executive committee of the Knesset without being defined as such. A draft constitution placed before the Constitution Committee, the Provisional State Council proposed to weaken the Prime Minister and his government by giving the President of the state the authority to appoint both the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff of the Army. Such a constitutional approach conflicted with Ben Gurion's revolutionary view of the type of strong executive leadership needed during the process of transition from a community to a state. In this transition period, he was determined not only to establish the institutions of the new state that would replace the communal institutions, but to divorce these new institutions from the divisive political traditions that had emerged in the non-sovereign national institutions of the Yishuv. Okay. So, third critique is unwillingness on Ben Gurion's part to adopt a constitution. Okay, and fourth, and this is a kind of general matter, but there's a sense that Ben Gurion remained wedded to socialist values long after their time had passed. Okay. And with the changing times and the changing needs, there may have been needs for new forms of government and new forms of economic structure, and Ben Gurion was resistant to those changes. Okay, let me stop here and just ask if there are any questions or comments.
Do you think that in the decision not to have a constitution was more because the Haredim think that our constitution is the Torah, or because Britain has no constitution? Two good rationales.
Yeah. So it's the latter. Ben Gurion was very taken with the British parliamentary system, and the term I prefer is he was allergic. He was allergic to anything that he worried might be an incursion onto the executive authority. And who could blame him? Meaning you're trying to form a state. You need some wiggle room, right? You can't be confined at every turn. It's like the difference between executive decision making and like you just need a little latitude. So it's not necessarily true that he thought the state should never have a constitution, but certainly in these early years he was very resistant to it, and a lot of it had to do, as you suggest, with the fact that he was very enamored of the parliamentary system of the British. Okay. Let me say a word. I want to talk about three quick, and again, this is really just to whet your appetite, three quick relationships that deserve a word. Ben Gurion's relationship with the Arabs, with the Bible, and with diaspora Judaism. Okay, a couple quick sources, and again, coming back to Anita Shapira's warning, like you really could find everything, and his position, is entitled to evolve and change over time, and these are important sources about Ben Gurion's thinking about the Arab question, beginning with source number 10. Okay. An early quote from 1919. Everybody sees the difficulty in the question of relations between Arabs and Jews, but not everybody sees that there is no solution to this question. No solution. There is a gulf and nothing can breach it. We as a nation want this country to be ours. The Arabs as a nation want this country to be theirs. Okay, so a very sober and a kind of realism about this quote. Source number source number 11, and I'll just mention that we talked about this a little in the past, but we have riots at the beginning of the 1920s. You have the Kotel riots at the end of the 1920s, and then you have the Arab Revolt in 1936, where the Arabs basically say, right? The Arabs basically say, we're making three demands of the British: cessation of Jewish immigration, cessation of land sales to Jews, and we need the government to hand over authority to the Arab majority. And Ben Gurion already confessed as early as 1929. He said, I didn't really believe it before, but 1929, he says, I actually believe there's such a thing as an Arab national movement. There is an Arab national movement. It's not just that there's people living here, and we need to contend with that movement. Source number 11 is a famous letter that he wrote to his son in 1937, following the report of the Peel Commission. It says the establishment of a Jewish state in only part of Palestine, Peel Commission, right, for partition. Does the establishment of a Jewish state in only part of Palestine advance or retard the conversion of this country into a Jewish country? Open question. My assumption, which is why I am a fervent proponent of a state, even though it is now linked to partition, is that a Jewish state on only part of the land is not the end, but the beginning. This is because this increase in possession is of consequence not only in itself, but because through it we increase our strength, and every increase in strength helps the possession of the land as a whole. The establishment of state, even if only in a portion of land, is the maximum reinforcement of our strength at the present time and a powerful boost to our historical endeavors to liberate the entire country. It's like I accept partition because I actually believe that partition today will mean Jewish sovereignty over all of Palestine one day in the future. What he was advocating, without saying it in so many words, is the transfer of Arab populations from Palestine to somewhere else, which sounds very jarring to us in the 21st century. Benny Morris wrote a lot about this and continues to write a lot about this. He's one of the leading historians and most important historians of the 21st century. And he just has, this is just an excerpt, you can read more from this piece in commentary, or just written books about it. He said there were good reasons for Ben Gurion's endorsement of transfer. The British Peel Commission had proposed it. The Arabs rebelling in Palestine were bent on uprooting the Zionist enterprise, and the Jews of Europe, under threat of destruction, were in dire need of a safe haven, and Palestine could not serve as one as long as the Arabs were attacking the Yishuv, and, as a result, the British were curtailing Jewish access to the country. So, it's an apologetic, but it basically says, don't get frustrated that Ben Gurion was making this proposal. A lot of people were making this proposal at the time, and without it, where was anybody going to go? Okay, Hitler's on the rise. It's 1937. The handwriting's on the wall. European Jewry is in a desperate situation. You can't get into the U.S. And if you try, what are you going to do? You're going to come to Palestine, and the Arabs are going to have a revolt, and then it's unworkable. It's untenable. So the solution is partition and the hope of one day sovereignty over the entire land. Okay. Next relationship I just want to mention, because I think it's so fascinating. Anita Shapiro has an article about this. It's not actually in her biography, but Ben Gurion's relationship to the Bible, and you have to know kind of all of Ben Gurion's writings and his whole life to be able to, only Anita Shapiro could trace this. But she says, for Ben Gurion at the beginning of his career, and this was true of all the Jews, or the majority of the Jews who had moved to Israel during the second Aliyah in the beginning of the 1900s, the Bible was very important to the second Aliyah. The idea was they could connect to their Jewish past without religion. Like, here's the Bible. We're a biblical people, but like there's no religion associated with it. And until much later in his career, Ben-Gurion rarely discussed seriously questions of history or culture as they pertained to the Bible. And Anita Shapira says, after 1948, everything changes. And all of a sudden, Ben-Gurion has a very different take on what the Bible means. I'll just give you one quote, and then you can look at the other quotes I have for you on the source sheet when there's more time. Source 13, Anita Shapira. It appears that the War of Independence constituted a parting of the waters for Ben-Gurion in this respect as well. His encounter with the open spaces of the land, with places whose names reappear in the stories of the Bible, sharpened his biblical awareness. The course of the conquest of the land awakened mythological associations. The book of Joshua suddenly took on a trenchant and current relevance. At the Sixth Conference on the Knowledge of Palestine held at Sukkot 1951, Ben-Gurion declared, not a single biblical commentator, Jewish or Gentile, medieval or contemporary, would have been able to interpret the book of Joshua in the way the Israel Defense Forces did this past year. From that time on, he often spoke in this vein. It's amazing. He's like, Tanakh? You can't understand Tanakh the way we understand Tanakh because now we're living Tanakh. You want to know what Jericho's about? I'll take you to Jericho, right? The Rashi and Ramban, like, they didn't if they didn't walk this land. The Ramban actually did make it to Palestine at the end of his life, but if they didn't walk this land, there's no way they could have known. And it's really an amazing kind of transformation, socialist, secular, and yet the Bible meant something different after 1948 for Ben-Gurion. Finally, a word about Ben-Gurion's relationship with the United States. A word from Ben-Gurion's diary. Again, he lived here in the U.S. during the First World War, and he came back all the time. A quote from his diary says, those who seek to build a new country in the desolate wilderness and arid land need to see how the hounded, exiled emigrants from England established a wealthy, mighty state, the resources and creative powers which are incomparable. He was very taken with what the United States had been able to accomplish. Tom Segev goes so far as to say that Ben-Gurion believed, the U.S. had so many lessons for Israel: the power of mass immigration, the notion of a melting pot, a spirit of pioneerism in the Wild West. It's like this all came from America, and this was ingrained. It was such an important part of who Ben-Gurion was, and like he actually borrowed it. Maybe didn't originate in his time in the U.S., but it certainly became highlighted and became bolder because of his time in the United States. I have for you on the source sheet. You could look at it. It's after source number 13. Ben-Gurion actually published a number of books in Israel. One of them was this book called the Yisker book, which became a bestseller. It was actually a book of lionized fallen Zionist heroes, and he was creating a mythos about Palestine and about Israel. He met his wife, the woman he would marry, in the New York Public Library as he was researching his book, The Land of Israel, Past and Present. And again, just because it's so contemporary, maybe I'll just share it with you very quickly. Source number 15. Okay, just before I share it with you, just park in your mind, and I'll just say it because it just happened, but park in your mind when a premier, a prime minister or president of Israel comes to the United States in 2026. Okay, and imagine that person going around to various campuses. Just picture in your head what that looks like. They protested President Herzog when he came to JTS. Okay, that's how far we've come. Look what was happening. This is amazing. 1967, before the 6-Day War. Okay, this is just a JTA article covering events of Israel Prime Minister visits U.S. Source number 15, JTA Daily News Bulletin. Ben-Gurion honored by New York University addresses students. And here he is, and he goes around and he speaks in 3 languages, Hebrew and Yiddish and English, and he meets with the faculty of JTS, and he goes and he spends an afternoon at Yeshiva University. He spoke Hebrew there. Dr. Samuel Belkin, president of Yeshiva, was host for the occasion. And then in his hard driving schedule, he received an audience of 400 in the auditorium of NYU Law School, where he lectured in English. He was awarded the degree of honorary doctor of law by Dr. James H. Hexter, president of NYU. Earlier, he was given a private dinner, the president's suite at NYU. In the course of 60 years, how much has the world changed? Okay. I want to share with you a closing quote by Anita Shapira. I want to reflect on 5 or 6 leadership lessons that I think we can extract from the life of Ben-Gurion, and then I want to wrap up with an excerpt from 1945. This is the quote from Anita Shapira. I love this quote. It captures so much. We'll return to a couple of these themes. Anita Shapira, Ben-Gurion biography. 1960, Richard Lichtheim, a veteran revisionist, wrote to Ben-Gurion wishing him a long duration for his life and work and saying, "You have what Bismarck called civil courage, the courage to do or fight for things which are not to the majority's liking or even plain unpopular." He concluded that is the true mark of the statesman who is not only a politician, but a leader. This definition pinpoints a crucial quality that made Ben-Gurion Ben-Gurion. His other qualities were a sense of historical timing and opportunity, resolve, tenaciousness, and a willingness to take calculated risks. His recognition that the establishment of the Jewish state would require a bloody war and his readiness to bear the brunt of responsibility for it, which in retrospect seems almost self-evident, were at the time stunning intuitions leading to decisive actions unprecedented in Jewish history. And, the bellwether, the question you can always ask is, if it weren't Ben-Gurion, would the next guy, the replacement, have made the same decision? And it's really fascinating to, do that exercise with so many in the key moments of Ben-Gurion's life. And sometimes the answer is yes, of course, another leader, anybody would have done that. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know who else would have made that call. That was really bold. That was really wild. Who would have predicted? And those, of course, are some of the moments that shape history, and those are some of the moments that make Ben-Gurion Ben-Gurion. 6 quick points that I think are relevant for this moment, and then we'll wrap up, and then I'm happy to take questions. Point number 1, it's so obvious, but you have to say it. For Ben-Gurion, the nation, the land, the purpose, the goal, the people of Israel always came first. And it's like, imagine if you had leaders in 2026 who just had this sense, like, there's the country, and then there's me. Like, there's a greater good, and whatever. And if people would put the state ahead of the person, we'd all be in a better place. Second, in a lot of ways, Ben-Gurion was an arch pragmatist, and he had this ability to recognize and seize the historic moment of opportunity, and the sense that, like, it's now or never. And it's an intuition. It's like, we got to act. And again, that's one of those places where you can plug it in and say, not everyone would have been so bold and so courageous and so decisive. Sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes you get it right. In Ben-Gurion's case too, but the willingness to take the bold step, that is a leadership lesson. Number 3, to appreciate the role of the diaspora in the establishment and preservation of the Jewish state. And again, there's lots to say about this in the 21st century. Ben-Gurion was always going back to New York. He was always going back to America, and he appreciated that the project of the Jewish state was not going to happen without the support of the Jews of the diaspora. The Jews of the diaspora are not the citizens of Israel, but that doesn't mean they don't have a role to play in the life and destiny of Israel. Number 4, From Anita Shapiro, the sense that returning to the land is also returning to our biblical roots. And finally, number 5, sort of where I started, with a joke, what are you writing, Mr. Ben-Gurion? It's like, I'm writing history. To see yourself as an actor and a writer of the Jewish story, which is always how Ben-Gurion perceived himself. And if everyone sees themselves as an actor and an arbiter of the Jewish future, well, then we all become actors and arbiters of the Jewish future. I want to close with an excerpt from a book by a man by the name of Rabbi Judah Nadich. Anyone know who Rabbi Judah Nadich was? Rabbi Judah Nadich was the highest-ranking Jewish chaplain in the American Army at the end of the Second World War. So it was October 1945, and Ben-Gurion went to visit the DP camps. It was the first time any Jewish leader had visited a DP camp. Judah Nadich wrote a memoir in 1953 called Eisenhower and the Jews, and this is an excerpt from his memoir. Last source on your sheet. I'm sorry, it's a little small. Arriving in Frankfurt, 1945. Arriving in Frankfurt in the following morning, Friday, October 19th, I took Ben-Gurion through the Army routine of billeting office, finance office, and visitors bureau, the bottom of the page. After lunch, I took Mr. Ben-Gurion in my car to the first DP camp that he would visit at Zionism. Both for him and for myself, as well as for the many hundreds of Jews in the camp, it was an unforgettable experience. We drove into the camp just a little distance beyond the gates, and I parked my car, asking Mr. Ben-Gurion to remain inside until I should make the necessary arrangements. Stepping out of my car, I was quickly surrounded by a number of the DPs, the displaced persons, Holocaust survivors, and several of the members of their central committee came up to chat with me. My visits to Zionism were not infrequent, nor were they unusual, and our conversation began as it normally did. With the detailing of the most recent complaints by the DPs, suddenly, one of the Jews in the group happened to peer into my automobile and, recognizing the strong face and white shock of hair, suddenly screamed in an unearthly voice, Ben-Gurion! Ben-Gurion! Like one man, the entire camp turned toward the car and began shrieking, shouting the name of the man who was accepted by all of them as their own political leader. Displaced persons, October 1945, right? How many months earlier had they been in concentration camps? But he was far more than that to them. He was the personal embodiment of all their hopes for the future. During all the many years of their hell, during what had seemed the several lifetimes of their subjection to Nazi debasement and degradation, during the years of actual physical and mental torture, that which had kept them alive, that which had buoyed them up, even amidst the darkest days, was the yearning, the longing, the hope for Palestine. They dared dream that perhaps someday all of this black nightmare would be behind them and they would live again as free people on their own soil, in their own state. That hope had given them that last ounce of strength which they had needed to be counted among the handful of survivors at the end. Palestine, Palestine. Now, after all these years, here was Palestine right in the midst of their DP camp on German soil. For who better than Ben-Gurion personified Eretz Yisrael and its fight for freedom and independence? He was the embodiment of all their hopes and aspirations, and his physical presence in their midst was like a cheerful and happy omen of the fact that the horrible nightmare was indeed ended. The black night was over, and the first rays of a new dawn were bursting over the skies of their miserable camp. One more page. The shrieks and the cries multiplied, and the crowd quickly grew larger and larger until I became frightened of a possible riot. I appealed to the pride of the people and to their desire to show Ben-Gurion how well-ordered and self-disciplined they were. I promised them that they would all have the chance to see and hear Ben-Gurion if they would follow my instructions. Quickly, they gathered together in the group in the camp auditorium, and the word was flashed throughout the camp in a few minutes. I led Ben-Gurion into the large jammed hall, and all the seats occupied, all the aisles filled, every inch of space packed, those unable to enter. standing near the doors and leaning across the windowsills. As I led Ben-Gurion into the hall, the people spontaneously burst into song. Hatikva, the hope that had never died, the hope that was unquenchable in their breasts, the hope that had kept them alive. As Ben-Gurion stood on the platform before them, the people broke forth into cheers, into song, and finally into weeping. At last he began to speak. His voice choked up, his eyes filled. He had to stop as he broke down for a moment. In the sudden quiet, one could hear the muffled sobbing from all the sides of the auditorium. Very few eyes were dry. For the incredible was true. The impossible had happened. Ben-Gurion was in their midst. And they had lived, despite Hitler, the Nazis, and all their collaborators, with all the diabolical instruments of destruction at their command. They had lived, despite them all, to this day, when they could welcome Ben-Gurion. He got choked up. I got choked up. We all got choked up. What Herzl symbolized in 1903, Ben-Gurion symbolized in 1945. He was the living embodiment of the dream that Israel could really become a reality. He was a complicated guy with a lot of achievements and a lot of flaws. And he also was and remains a kind of mythical figure in the history of the land of Israel and the history of the Jewish people. His contributions remain as important today as they were 78 years ago. And he continues to have so much to teach us. And he created so many moments that continue to inspire us. With that, we close, but I am more than happy to stay on and take questions or comments. And thank you to one and all for joining.
Oh, that was masterful, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
I unmuted.
Rabbi Levine, since Robert,
Thank
just
you,
wondering,
Rabbi.